Welcome to State of the Nation and the Building of a New Republic. This is Melinda Cole Klein. How on earth did the rebelling American colonists win the Revolution against the best trained, equipped, and provisioned Army and Navy in the world? This is not a simple answer. It was a combination of factors. I would like you to think about the following 7 points as food for thought. Number 1, luck fell on the side of the Americans. Number 2, brilliance by George Washington at times and adaptability of his officer corps. Number 3, determination by colonials and enlisted men and officers to keep fighting year after year. Number 4, costly, strategic, what I mean by this is military errors by the British. Number 5, poorly or badly timed choices made by British officers who were motivated by personal glory. Number 6, the alliance secured with France allowed the Americans to be better prepared to fight regarding supplies, leadership, training, and weaponry. And finally, number 7, the ability for the French Navy to cause such a distraction in the West Indies over possession or repossession of English sugar islands by 1779 and in the Indian Ocean. Britain refocused its attentions to protecting its economic interests with their plantation island colonies, which was their largest source of wealth for English landowners and business, through rum production. Second, of course, was tea, along with luxury items imported from the Asian Orient. What were some of the looming post-war issues facing the newly conceived Republican government? National security fell on the colonists to provide and fund the infrastructure for their own military. The former colonists now had to create their own government administration. Thankfully, James Madison had been working for years on this issue. The nation now had to pay off its foreign debts incurred during the Revolution. The nation had to reinvent their economy from the ashes of early capitalism because, unlike Britain, they were colonies. They didn't have any colonies of their own. So mercantilism as an economic theory would not work for them. Finally, they had to decide what members of this new nation were to be its citizens. Most of the propertied and intellectual class admittedly believed not everyone should vote. While they were not in full agreement, the Founding Fathers originally designed a federal republican state. It had a weak centralized government with the power at the state level because the state-level politicians feared that a strong centralized government would limit their powers and nationalize institutions. Most states favored a representative-style government. Then and now, the states of the Union differed in their economies, populations, geography, and political philosophies. Advocates for each style of government include the following 2 positions. First, strong centralized government, such as encouraged by George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and John Adams as Federalists, as they began to call their faction, feared a broad, voting-based democracy as the people at the state level could not be trusted. They would likely not make the decisions that would outweigh their localized special interests and traditional views and preferences. Secondly, those who were not convinced the federal government would honor their states' rights are remembered as Americans who favored the ideals of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Anti-Federalists like Thomas Jefferson and later Andrew Jackson were pro-states' rights. They wanted a weak centralized government and the power at the state level, sending the voices of the people through representation to the White House. In a unitary republican state, like the Fifth French Republic of today, all of the power lies at the federal level. This type of republican state had the final say over the citizens' rights in the provinces, not the other way around. In a federal state, like here in America, we do possess a strong centralized representative government, but the power of ruling one's people is at the state level. At the Philadelphia Convention of 1786, the Congress failed to agree to modify the Articles of Confederation. A constitution was needed. As mentioned above, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay would write and have published the Federalist Papers. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 was held in Philadelphia. This would be followed in 1788 with Madison and Patrick Henry leading the fight for constitutional revisions before it was ratified because it did not include state-specific rights. Madison and others were against a separate Bill of Rights, believing modifications should be made before it was ratified. But Federalists disagreed. Political division grew. The Constitutional Convention of 1787, over the course of 4 months, 55 delegates comprised of lawyers, gentlemen merchants, farmers, and planters collected in Philadelphia to debate. Today, when judges wish to understand the intention of constitutional framers and those who ratified it, they frequently refer to the Federalist Papers. According to contemporary accounts, the Federalist Papers have been quoted in almost 300 Supreme Court decisions. The Great Compromise became the formation of a representative lower house called the House of Representatives, intended to be the voice of the people. Those elected by voters served terms of 2 years. This compromise solved the problem of smaller and larger states by having equal representation. For each representative, a state district needed 30,000 people. Slavery was a hot political topic for Southerners because the population numbers regulated the number of representatives a state could have in Congress. Southerners demanded some type of recognition be adopted for their unfree slave population. Result: it was decided that 5 African slaves would count as 3 free people, allowing Southern states with low white populations to have a modicum of equal representation in the lower house. Slavery under the Constitution of 1787. Instead of trying to eliminate slavery under the new government, the Northerners made it a priority to regulate trade and commerce. They kicked it down the road for a later day. The upper house, otherwise known as the Senate, was intended to contain members considered wise and just, similar to the body in England known as the House of Lords. Like in ancient Rome, senators are intended to be the wisdom of the government. This would create balance between the interest of individual representatives and the needs of the federal government for the good of all its citizens. Today, a senator offers service of a 6-year term. 2 senators are elected per state. The Articles of Confederation from 1777 saw the government through the war and into early post-war years. However, this government document had limitations to stand as a national document in the formation of a federal republic. Because the Articles of Confederation were due to expire in 1790, the Congress knew they needed to evaluate this weak political document that got the government through the Revolution, whether or not to revise and amend or to begin again. The Articles of Confederation did not have the power to provide a powerful infrastructure to run a new nation. Reasons why in 1787 the Articles of Confederation could not continue to be used. Consider the following 6 points. Number 1, the conservatives wanted ability to tax. To tax in those days meant the ability to levy tariffs on imported goods. Number 2, no income or even state taxes yet. That came in the 20th century. The conservatives did not want to tax our exported goods, and they wanted to allow local industries to develop. Number 3, conservatives wanted to control the direction and growth of American commerce. Number 4, conservatives believed that the best direction for Americans, this means family economic prosperity equals happiness, meant that they needed to channel the direction of economic growth to become an industrially strong capitalist nation. Number 5, conservatives wanted a uniform currency. And finally, number 6, the creation of a military, a strong force to remove the Indians once and for all and to secure the Republic from outside threats. It is important to remember the Articles of Confederation of 1777 were not a failure. The Patriots won the war, created alliances, borrowed money to keep the war going, and learned how to fight a European-style war against the most powerful military power in the world. All in all, the Articles of Confederation operated well for a successful young government structure. Its weak and restrictive design, which made it on purpose like this, could not be a national document that would create a centralized government. To encourage popular support of a new political document plan, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton collaborated on what is remembered as the Federalist Papers, 1787 and 1788. The Federalist Papers are a set of 85 political essays published in journals as stand-alone articles. It would be in paper number 10 that James Madison would convincingly argue that with a nation composed of many regional interests, it would be Republican ideals that would best manage a large state better than political interests held by the few. It should be noted that the Federalist Papers are the best primary sources when studying the creation of the U.S. Constitution of 1787. An additional writer included 5 essays by John Jay. It would be at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 that Madison proposed his draft of the Virginia Plan and a 3-branch political system that would become the foundation of the Constitution. The Constitution of 1787. The 55 delegates elected to meet in Philadelphia behind closed doors and closed windows. They met in secret. The Constitution was made through compromise and political posturing. It did not consider the entire population. Patrick Henry, as governor of Virginia, had no desire to see the state of Virginia lose power to a strong centralized government and dissented from the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson was not there. He was in Paris as the U.S. ambassador and was not interested in this plan for a constitution and creating a strong centralized government structure. Samuel Adams was not there. Neither was John Hancock. As previously indicated, the main goal of the 55 was the formation of the structure of a strong centralized government. The Hamilton, Adams, Washington Federalists won what they had wanted all along: a federal republic with a strong centralized government structure. To ensure national strength, the Founding Fathers wanted political and economic stability. Suffrage, this is the right to vote, was restricted to male property owners. Today and in the past, this population has the most to lose. Additionally, property ownership was viewed as the foundation of the happiness theory, in which Americans who worked hard could own their own homes. Home and family were to be protected under the law by this particular government. Because George Washington did not want to be viewed as a tyrant, he agreed that states' rights had to be protected. This president would serve 2 terms in office. Elections are held on even years. The Electoral College, the institution that validates U.S. voting process, elected George Washington in February of 1789 and again in 1792. While there are 11 in the running for president during this first election, he was very popular with the people and his peers. And the first presidential election did not take place until the Constitution of 1787 was in the process of being ratified by the states. The Constitution became a series of articles that appeared in newspapers to convince the voting public, especially non-New England former colonists, to adopt this new document. To date, Washington is the only president to receive 100% of the electoral votes possible. Congress voted to pay the office of the president $25,000 a year. But the president initially declined the money as he was a wealthy man. Eventually, he conceded to the wages because he did not want the office of the president to be identified as a post to which only wealthy men should fill. Ever the Southern gentleman, Mr. President, as he preferred to be called, set the precedent for the title of this new office of authority. No political parties existed at the time. Washington advocated that if political parties existed, citizens would vote along party lines, and this would not promote the best leader to hold office. Partiality to political ideologies, Washington suggested, would create a fractured Congress and expand individual politics, like what we see today. When George Washington ran for political office, the presidential runner-up became vice president. The 12th Amendment to the Constitution of 1804 changed this procedure. This revised practice requires a presidential candidate to select and run with a pre-selected vice president. John Adams was the first vice president, and Thomas Jefferson was Washington's second vice president. In time, political factions did develop between the Federalists, Washington, Adams, and politicians like Alexander Hamilton because of the number of uneducated property men taking part in the electoral process. Federalists were educated, wealthy, and did not trust state-level politicians to vote beyond their own local interests. But the brilliance of James Madison, also remembered by some as the architect of the Constitution and political philosopher, advocated that a system of checks and balances would maintain an expanding empire while protecting citizen rights and autocratic rule by a tyrant. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, both Virginians, were like-minded politicians. Together they formed the Republican Party. Both of these highly intelligent men were key opponents to the Federalists. While in office, Washington saw the settlement of pre-revolutionary debts for the people, peace with the Indians, and New York City became the first temporary capital while Washington, D.C. was being built. The following are 3 of Washington's accomplishments as president. Number 1, Washington protected Native American land rights under the Civilized Treaties Act of 1790, allowing the U.S. government to acquire Indian lands and exclude sales to private individuals. Number 2, Washington and other Federalists supported the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And number 3, George Washington, as president, created the first Supreme Court. Having fought for liberty and self-government, Americans now had the task of creating an effective government to protect their rights. After the Revolution, the main tasks of this new government were the following 6 aims. Number 1, to pay off the war debt. Number 2, to reduce the army. Number 3, it needed a new economic theory outside of mercantilism to conduct trade. Number 4, to coexist with the Spanish. Number 5, to deal with Native Americans. Number 6, to supervise the white frontier settlements. However, there were more pressing issues at hand by 1783. It was agreed that the federal government would conduct the following 4 roles, primarily. Number 1, to conduct foreign affairs. Number 2, declare war and peace or raise troops required under congressional approval when necessary. Number 3, the coinage of money. And number 4, not to levy taxes without congressional approval. Though it was ratified by the states, many believed the Constitution of 1787 was incomplete, especially Republicans such as Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Because the Federalists were unwilling to alter the Constitution prior to its ratification, it fell to James Madison at the first U.S. Congress to propose 10 amendments to limit the power of the federal government. Madison and others clearly recognized the rights of citizens, residents, and visitors were not represented in the Constitution of 1787. State policies were guided by each other. Virginia had their Declaration of Rights that upheld freedom of worship, required search warrants, banned excessive fines, and banned the quartering of troops in private dwellings. Other states had powers that included trial by jury, free speech, press, and assembly. Many states opposed monopolies and imprisonment for debt. The U.S. Constitution was ratified by states between 1787 and 1790. In the last 200 years, it has seen only 27 amendments. The first 10 amendments are remembered as the Bill of Rights, of 1791, which protected the people in the nation against injury, undue hardship, and protected personal freedoms. Amendment 1, protection with the rights of free assembly, speech, press, and petition, while offering religious freedom by separating the government from religion. Amendments 2 and 3, citizen rights to bear arms, while the people should not be required to quarter soldiers in their homes. Amendments 4 through 8 are familiar as they were inherited from the English common law, in which citizens would be protected from illegal searches and seizures. The fifth protects against prosecution for the same crime twice. We call this in America double jeopardy. While you can claim the Fifth Amendment if you don't want to give evidence against yourself, and before you lose your liberty or material worth, your fate will be decided in a court of law first. The Sixth Amendment offers citizens the right to a speedy trial and to ensure fairness. The criminal will be provided with a lawyer, attorney, to represent his or her interests. Amendment 7 ensures the accused trial will be conducted with a jury present. And the eighth offers a measure of protection in regards to a judge mandating excessive bail. Amendments 9 and 10 are balancing acts between state and federal powers. Amendment 11 resulted in the right for states to keep lawsuits within their own state. Thus, citizens are not prosecuted at the federal level by national courts. After Amendment 12 was revised, it changed how vice presidents were chosen. From 1804, a vice presidential candidate would no longer be the presidential runner-up, but a running mate of the presidential nominee. A separation of powers was aimed to promote a system of checks and balances between the three major political features: the office of the president, this is the executive branch, the members of Congress, the legislative, and Supreme Court is the judiciary branches. According to James Madison, this was an acceptable design. While elected officials serve for a number of predetermined years each election cycle, justices of the Supreme Court were elected for a life term, unless they chose to retire. Since 1947, with Amendment 22, presidents can only be elected into office twice and serve a period of 4 years each term. The legislative branch consisted of the Senate and House of Representatives. The Senate possesses veto power, in which they can block self-serving aims of the House of Representatives. This is the voice of the people. Congressional actions taken by the first U.S. Congress, 1789 to 1791. 3 sessions took place during this Congress. Major actions include the following. In 1789, passage of the Hamilton Tariff and the Judicial Act. Establishment of the Department of State, which would conduct foreign affairs, Department of War, and Department of the Treasury. Congress sent to the states of the Union 12 constitutional amendments to ratify. 10 were ratified. They became the Bill of Rights. In 1790, a plan was established to implement the first U.S. Census. Next was the passage of the Naturalization Act, Patent Act, Copyright Act, and the Indian Intercourse Act to regulate commerce with Native Americans. And finally, in 1790, was the establishment of the District of Columbia as the seat of government with the Residence Act. The final meeting of the first U.S. Congress was held in 1791. This established the first Bank of the United States by charter, located at 120 South 3rd Street, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, now a National Historic Monument. Secondly was the passage of the Whiskey Act. This domestic tariff, as promoted by Alexander Hamilton, became the first tax on a U.S.-produced commercial good intended mostly for local consumption. This excise tax was tacked onto spirits because it was argued to be a luxury, not essential. Such luxury items that give pleasure, if taxed, reformers argued would reduce drunkenness and poverty among the lower sorts, such as frontier farmers, laborers, and the laboring class in general, who have over the centuries shown little incentive to self-regulate their behaviors. A sin tax, when applied to spirits and later other commodities such as cigarettes, was intended to help curb self-indulgent personal habits while filling the federal bank with tax money. The whiskey tax infuriated poor frontier farmers who often made money as a side venture, the distilling of surplus grain into whiskey. Small farmers believed Hamilton and the Federalists in general directly targeted their economy by singling out this product. To them, this was an income tax not legally applied until 1913 with the 16th Amendment. While large distilleries enjoyed tax breaks and paid a flat fee, small farmers paid per gallon. These poor Americans protested to the unfairness of the tax, as it favored the rich and punished the poor. The efforts by frontiersmen to petition the government to revise this act failed, but petitions in 1791 were sent to representatives. In time, Congress modified the law, but Western farmers were still not satisfied. By September 1791, a gang tarred and feathered a tax collector. Most historians agree the resistance, remembered as the Whiskey Act Rebellion, took place for the most part in Pennsylvania. Resistance and violence continued till 1794. By then, large distilleries were not paying the tax either. At this point, the federal government deployed almost 13,000 militia recruits to bring peace. Washington and his government were recognized by law-abiding citizens as doing the right thing: repress domestic revolts and punish resistance to abiding by U.S. laws. Alexander Hamilton was recognized by many of his peers and later historians as possessing a brilliant administrative mind. During George Washington's first term in office, at only 32 years of age, Hamilton served as the Secretary of the Treasury. After only 10 days in office, Congress ordered Hamilton to, quote, prepare and report a plan for adequate support of public credit, end of quote. Hamilton clearly understood the advantages of a powerful industrial economy. Contrary to the Jeffersonian and Republican economic ideals, past and present, Hamilton sought a close alliance between business and government. Hamilton contended that self-interest would impel the nation's wealthy and influential men, such as merchants and bankers, to support the government, since their enterprises would be best protected by a strong centralized federal authority. Thus, Hamilton's economic plan would include features of industry, banking, and finance. One of the looming problems for the government was the national debt, while states in varying degrees had incurred debts as well. The national debt under Hamilton had grown to $75 million. Far from worried, Hamilton believed the national debt was a blessing because it created alliance between bankers and the government. Hamilton's unique contribution was to change the debt, ordinary liability, into an asset for pumping life into the whole financial system. U.S. government bonds became increasingly attractive to investors, and it encouraged European investment in the U.S. financial system. While the government had to pay 6% interest on foreign loans, it made a 20% profit by reinvesting money at home. Every 3 months, almost $1 million was dumped into the American economy, making new business ventures possible. Because the colonies had operated as a source of raw materials for the British Empire, mercantilism worked for the mother country. However, for the new nation of the United States, lacking colonies of their own, the economic theory of mercantilism could not work. The government had to offer an economic plan to its citizens, as the government controlled and regulated trade and commerce. Hamilton's report on manufacturers was presented to Congress in 1791. In this proposal, Alexander Hamilton, the financial genius, suggested to pass tariffs that would protect the emerging industrial businesses in the states until they could develop products that would compete in an open market overseas. This would, in theory, allow the growth of manufacturing in America. With manufacturing, immigrants would come and settle the land. This would increase the tax base from the number of individuals that owned their own land and/or home. Additionally, the government would offer subsidies to businesses allowing growth. Under this plan, the United States would become the ideal nation that would bring inventors, scientists, manufacturers, along with workers. Once in place, high import tariffs encouraged domestic manufacturing and a demand for employment. Keep in mind this economic plan stood in direct opposition to free trade economics of the present day. All the while, the Jeffersonians and like-minded individuals promoted an agrarian economic future for America and the separation of the state and the economy. The First National Bank of America, another Hamilton idea that received congressional approval, would offer credit, provide loans, be in control of the nation's revenue, and collect taxes. This banking system, modeled after the Bank of England, attracted considerable foreign attention and investments. Because it constitutionally was in question, it would require rechartering. Andrew Jackson vetoed the rechartering of the Second National Bank during his presidency in 1833, believing banking should belong to the private sector, not the government, and this proved to be a wise move. In 1792, the New York Stock Exchange began trading with its in-house 24 stockbrokers. It was located at 68 Wall Street. This would begin the financial dimension of America's economic growth. The Franco-American Alliance of 1778 became void with the change in the French government. The Americans borrowed $6 million in supplies and money from the French government. Due to the trade concessions made in the Treaty of Paris of 1783, France was not repaid the money the Patriots borrowed. Some of the money loaned to the Patriots and used within the company had been borrowed by the French government from Dutch bankers. But after the war, no cash would be coming to France. This left France essentially bankrupt. This debt severely impoverished the economy during the reign of Louis XVI. In 1789, the people took control of their government, killed their king and queen, and created the Republic of France. In the 1790s, France became engaged in expanding its boundaries by warring with its European neighbors. To fight this war, the British Navy required manpower. And because the British government did not recognize former American colonials as U.S. citizens, they regularly raided American ships to procure sailors as war depleted their manpower numbers. This practice that the U.S. government considered a violation of their rights on the high seas would slowly drag on until the War of 1812. While Britain and other European nations warred with France, the United States remained neutral, as the European superpowers battled on land and sea for land and other resources. During the 1790s and until the War of 1812, the businesses and financiers conducted commercial and banking transactions with France. Britain, as a trade partner, saw this as a stab in the back. Not only did they carry off American seamen, but American merchant cargo as well, violating U.S. neutrality principles and practices. To assist with a positive trade balance, the President and Congress agreed to send John Jay, Washington's Chief Justice, to London to resolve outstanding political and economic issues between the two nations. The United States government was very concerned with the collection of military posts established in the northwestern U.S. territories. In the Treaty of Paris, 1783, the British had agreed to vacate these posts. In addition, British bothersome trade issues and rights to shipping caused serious tensions between the two nations. Because Jay was a Federalist and considered pro-British, Jefferson's followers only reluctantly agreed to his mission. Jay had little influence and power because the British government was at war with revolutionary France, and they were not willing to concede points to the United States. Jay was able to get the British to agree to the surrender of northwestern military posts and to establish a Canada-Maine boundary, while details of the revolutionary debts and the British seizure of American ships and seamen on the high seas were included. The final settlement that John Jay brought back to America was received with disdain, as it made Britain the primary trading partner to which critics argued American neutrality offered trade with any nation, regardless of the political atmosphere. With approval, the Jay Treaty was implemented by the President. The rights of women did not change in the new republic, nor would they until the 20th century. English law required that the rights of women belonged to her husband, or if she was unmarried, her father. This English legal standard was upheld by the newly formed United States. Women were barred from positions of high status too, and could only serve as ministers in Baptist or Quaker churches. Formerly, women had tended families as apothecaries and midwives, But as states began requiring a university education for medicine, this profession was closed to them until decades later. A medical education in the new republic was only open to men. Many grammar schools and some secondary schools were open to girls, but they did not receive the same education in boys. Boys received training in Latin, Greek languages, with a concentration of mathematics. However, debates in 1784 created a stir regarding the education of women. The argument went, quote, "If educated, they would make better wives and mothers," end of quote. Most Westerners believe this today. An 18th century British writer, Mary Wollstonecraft, wrote several novels, essays, and children's books. She was best known for her essay, A Vindication of the Rights of Men, published in 1790, and A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, published in 1792. You may be able to find these online if you wish to read them. In the United States, whether or not to educate women was resolved under Republican motherhood. As educated wives made better mothers under the patriarchal social order, this implied the doors to colleges and universities would open to them. But this is not what happened, at least not for decades to come. Under Republican motherhood, women did not get the vote. They did not attend university. They would not hold political office. And respectable women did not work outside the home. Respectable women of the new republic became the center of the home and for its members. The Republican government argued it was not their responsibility to vote or hold public office, but to stay home, create responsible citizens and orderly communities. Thus, as compared with their mothers and grandmothers, the proper place for a woman of the new republic was in the home, not in business and not at school. While politicians debated new institutions to be enjoyed by its citizens and residents, the government considered the creation of a national brewery. After all, brewing and consumption of beer was a national pastime and contributed to a healthy diet, as it was a source of vitamins, which we well know today. In 1789, George Washington stood behind beer produced in America and supported the brewing industry as an American business enterprise. It seemed the president's example encouraged Massachusetts to pass legislation designed to encourage the establishment of additional breweries and local production of beer. New Hampshire passed legislation that waived property taxes for local breweries to stimulate growth of this industry. It would be in 1808 in Saratoga, New York, that reformers hosted one of the country's first temperance movements. While water and milk were not safe to drink until almost a century later, temperance movements encouraged non-consumption of alcohol as a part of their attempts to change social habits, especially among the poor and the laboring class. These were social members that required the most in regulation. By 1810, the brewery business was running strong. By the first U.S. Census, it lists 132 breweries producing 185,000 barrels of beer annually. The three largest brewery states were Pennsylvania, New York, and Ohio. While a national brewery was not established, breweries and taverns held a special place in the colonial and U.S. economies as centers of politics, communication, commerce, and a place of hospitality. there was not an agreement arrived at regarding the creation of a national religion. However, custom and Christian principles mandated that on Sundays Americans should not work, gamble, or play games, but should spend the day giving thanksgiving with family and friends and saying prayers. In the end, it was decided that the private sector would be in control of creating and maintaining their own houses of worship. The nation was founded on religious freedoms, and the government, unlike King Henry VIII in the 1530s, did not seem motivated enough to create a unique Protestant religion for its citizens. All the while, this post-revolutionary society elevated Enlightenment ideas of individual liberty and reason that challenged many church traditions. By the 1790s, a minority of white Americans were members of formal churches, and for families and individuals living on the frontier regions, few churches were found outside of port cities, especially far from commercial centers.